Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daniel Achach. I'm the Executive Director at Regiolex Consultancy Limited. Regiolex Consultancy Limited is a premium consultancy firm headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, but we have a representation across the continent of Africa. We have a representation from the western part of Africa, based in Ghana. We have representation in the southern part of Africa. We have Botswana, we have Zambia, we have Malawi, and so on and so forth. So we have a continent-wide reach in terms of representation. So Regiolex Consultancy Limited was formed almost a decade ago, about 2015. And what inspired the formation of Regiolex Consultancy Limited is for purposes of filling in the gap that we felt existed in the continent when it comes to issues of capacity in international trade. And so if you realize that issues to do with the integration in the continent, the subject of regional integration, has been around for a while. I would say for about 4 decades, the continent has been discussing issues to do with integration, regional integration. But then there is still capacity gap, both in the government and also in the private sector. So those who are negotiating agreements on behalf of the African countries in the side of the government do not have that, the capacity, the technical know-how to do this. Or in cases where we have, then we're talking about the numbers. Do we have the necessary or the requisite numbers in terms of mass to be able to address the concerns that are there? And also in the private sector, when you're talking about, ideally, when you're talking about issues of trade and cross-border trade for that matter, governments themselves do not trade. Those who trade is the private sector. So when we are developing these rules, when we are negotiating trade agreements, we are getting into trade arrangements, these rules are being made for use by the private sector. And so you then need capacity in the private sector to be able to know the opportunities that are created under these agreements. And so then Regiolex comes in to fill this gap by training or capacity building on the side of the government, and also capacity building the private sector to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that have been presented in terms of these arrangements. But our role, or our mandate, is not just limited to capacity building alone. Regiolex also carries out research in the various areas that deal with international trade law and trade policy. And therefore, we carry out studies on areas that we feel are important, both for governments or decision makers and policy makers to be able to present certain positions, policy positions, that would be helpful to their domestic industries. And so in this sense, we've covered a number of, we've done a number of research, and we've done a number of studies that we've shared both with governments, private sectors, and also some studies we've also done that are commissioned by the regional economic communities. Regiolex is composed of various members who are specialized in different areas. We have a range of lawyers, trade lawyers, who are specialized in different aspects of trade. So within our group, we have lawyers who are trained, for instance, in intellectual property. We have lawyers who are trained in investments, in competition, or who have specialized in these areas. And so we see how we then marry these, different capacities or different trainings in terms of delivering to our clientele. And we are not just lawyers alone, we also have other specialties. You realize that trade, by its very essence, it's a multidisciplinary area. And so we also work with economists, we work with finance experts, and so on and so forth, depending on the demands of particular projects or particular assignments that we have at any given time. So what do we do at Regiolex? As I've already mentioned, number one, we offer trainings and capacity building for both the government officials and the private sector. And so for government officials, we focus mainly on trade officers and the officers, government officers who sit in the regulatory bodies or the implementing bodies of various, that deal with the various aspects of trade. For instance, when we are discussing issues to do with digital trade, for instance, we would be looking at government bodies that deal with communication, government bodies that deal with IT, and so on and so forth. And so we capacity build to look at how do their work relate with the whole concept of international trade. For instance, if it's a regulator, the domestic regulations, how do they respond to the obligations that governments have taken in the international trade agreements? So we capacity build them in a way that then when they sit in forums that people are negotiating trade agreements, they're able to represent the interests of the particular countries that they then, they come from. But we also offer these trainings to the private sector. And for the private sector, we're looking at, ultimately, the private sector are the users of these agreements. So all the agreements, the legal framework, the institutional framework that comes out of these, the ultimate user is the private sector. And I say so because in trade, in cross-border trade, governments do not trade. When you are saying, for instance, you're saying that Malawi has exported sugar to Kenya. It's not the government of Malawi that will have exported that sugar to Kenya, but it is some farmer in Malawi who will have produced that sugar and exported that sugar to Kenya. And therefore, the private sector is very critical. At the end of the day, if the private sector is not able to use the opportunities that are granted or that are presented under these agreements, then these agreements become moribund, they become obsolete. And therefore, our target is also to the private sector to make them understand what opportunities are there for them. For example, Kenya is currently negotiating a trade deal with the US, although that has taken a bit of the negotiations have gone slow with the coming of the new President Trump. But then the areas, if you look at the coverage of the kind of negotiation that Kenya was doing with the US, you're talking about trade in goods, you're talking about trade in services, you're talking about intellectual property, you're talking about digital products, and so on and so forth. And so you need to then know who are the private sector interested in these particular areas, and what is their interest in the market of the US. Because when you're negotiating a trade agreement, then you're saying, we are opening our market for the US is opening their market for us. So what are what we call the offensive interests? What are our interests in that other market? And so we then engage with the private sector in this kind of way, so that ultimately the kind of an agreement that the government ends up with is an agreement that is beneficial to Kenya, to Kenya and to the country that is negotiating that agreement. The areas that we cover under Regiolex, we deal with basically all areas and aspects of trade. Some of them that we've done a lot of work in the area of digital trade. We've been involved in capacity building in the FCFTA digital trade protocol. We've looked at digital trade protocol in a very in-depth way, and we've trained or engaged with a number of countries in the continent when it comes to now developing country-specific positions on digital trade protocol. We've done a lot of work on the area of the protocol on FCFTA protocol on intellectual property. We've done investments, we've done competition, and so on and so forth. So we cover almost all the aspects, all the areas of international trade. And just to mention a few of the projects that we've covered under Regiolex Consulting, we've assisted a number of countries in the continent to develop laws and policies that are compliant with their WTO obligations. For instance, we've assisted a number of countries to develop legal and institutional framework on dumping, basically trade remedies, dumping, subsidies, and safeguards, laws and policies that are consistent or that are in consonant with their obligations under the WTO agreement. We've also engaged with a number of countries across the continent when it comes to their negotiation under the African Continental Free Trade Area in terms of developing their national negotiation positions on various protocols. I've mentioned the protocol on digital trade, where we've trained a number of officers and the private sector on their role in all the other developing country positions on the negotiation on the annexes, the rules of origin, annex on fintechs, and so on and so forth. This we've done in a number of countries. I could mention we've done it in Kenya, we've done it in Botswana, we've done it in Malawi, we've done it in Zambia, and a number of other countries to basically develop their capacity now when it comes to the negotiations. We've also engaged with the RECs, the regional economic communities, and for this we've worked very closely with COMESA in a number of areas. We've worked with COMESA in trade facilitation under the EDF 11 program. We've also worked with COMESA in terms of doing studies on trade remedies, the kind of legal and institutional framework that we have in COMESA and the necessary amendments that need to be done. We are currently looking forward to move that discussion further to a level that would perhaps involve spotting areas or seeing areas of amendment that would respond. We've also worked closely with the COMESA Court of Justice now when it comes to the practical aspects of some of these laws. So we've capacity built, we've trained the COMESA Court of Justice judges on aspects of trade remedies, and we've also been involved at a consultancy level in terms of looking at the regulations, the rules, and certain cases that have been filed in the court that deal with trade remedies. We've engaged with the East African community also considerably well on issues to do with trade in services, issues to do with mutual recognition agreements, and so on and so forth. And so we look forward to engaging more with the regional economic communities and also with at the national level and even the private sector in terms of developing our capacity as a continent. So Regiolex Consultancy looks forward to engaging more with the continent at the regional level, at the national level, and also at the private sector level in order to foster trade and also to improve intra-African trade within the continent. We can only trade better with each other in the continent when we reduce the barriers that are there, and we can only reduce these barriers through the trade negotiations and through capacity building, improving our ability to trade with each other. We therefore look forward to engaging with you, with the private sector, with the government, and even with the donors in terms of improving trade capacity within the continent. Thank you.